Hello, History 72A, Winter Quarter 2024. In part one of this lecture, we looked at the path that people in power in the Virginia colony took toward creating racialized chattel slavery. Virginia colony laws broke with English tradition in one and only one way. When it came to the condition of freedom or unfreedom, children were automatically assigned to the status of their mothers. In practice, in Virginia, this meant light fines for white men who fathered children, consensually or not, and given that truly free consent on the part of the enslaved woman was not possible, wealthy white men, plantation owners, were less and less likely to be subject to any legal repercussions at all, and their own children added to their property wealth in that context. The Maryland colony aimed for a similar construction of race based on African ancestry and tied to hereditary enslavement. But the particular context of the Maryland colony meant that the legislators followed a different path to the same goal. Maryland, to the north and east of Virginia here, developed tobacco plantations just slightly behind Virginia in time. You can see that geographically, they are not really distinct from one another on the Atlantic coast here. Maryland was established by a grant of land and governmental authority to a single individual rather than to a company. The person who received the grant of Maryland was a favorite of King Charles I of England, and you may or may not remember from our recent whirlwind account of English monarchs that Charles I was overthrown and beheaded by the parliamentarians. The Puritan, Oliver Cromwell, became head of the new government of England with the title Lord Protector. We have King Charles, who lost his head here, and Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, like the Pilgrims that settled in Plymouth in New England when we get there. But we're not there yet. Cromwell famously is supposed to have banned Christmas celebrations when he led England. Those of the English aristocracy who were Catholic had far more to worry about than midwinter celebrations, whether they got to have Christmas pudding or not. They were in danger of losing their land, titles, and lives. Cromwell took his Puritanism quite seriously. The founder of Maryland was Catholic and wanted Maryland to serve as a refuge for fellow Catholic gentry when Cromwell's government cleaned house in England. Most appointed officials in the Maryland colony ended up being Catholic, but most settlers were Protestants and, as in Virginia, came over as indentured servants. Like Virginia, Maryland turned to tobacco cultivation. Maryland was established about a generation later than Virginia, 1632 rather than 1607. This means that while Virginia's land in the prime tobacco growing region had pretty much all been claimed, Maryland still had available land for about a generation. Virginia offered indentured servants money with which they might be able to buy land as part of their freedom dues. In the early years, Maryland gave 50 acres of land as part of the freedom dues. As a reminder, the Virginia Company awarded land to the people who bought indentures and paid passage for the servants that they controlled or whom they controlled. Maryland gave land to the servants when their indentures ended as part of their freedom dues. Maryland developed a similar system of tobacco plantation agriculture and labor needs, but the colony lagged a bit behind Virginia. Remember that there are many types of human variation that can be used to build hierarchies, and they usually intersect with one another. In the early years, for any Chesapeake colony, the most important social distinction was between plantation owners, all of English ancestry, and everyone else, small farmers, indentured servants, and enslaved people. This does not mean that slavery and indentured servitude sat at the same level. Indentured servants, if they survived, got freedom and freedom dues at the end of a set term. From the second half of the 1600s, enslaved people served for life. But in the first half or so of the 17th century, some enslaved people could and did buy their freedom and own land. The 1664 Maryland Act concerning Negroes and other slaves, that's the name of it, said in its first paragraph, all Negroes or other slaves already within the province, and all Negroes and other slaves to be hereafter imported into the province, shall serve durante vita, that means for life. And all children born of any Negro or other slave shall be slaves as their fathers were for the term of their lives. Note that freedom or unfreedom follows the father here, not the mother as in Virginia. A clue to the reason why comes in the next paragraph of the law. Continuing on to paragraph 2 of the Maryland law, for as much as diverse freeborn English women, forgetful of the free condition and to the disgrace of our nation, marry Negro slaves, by which also diverse suits may arise touching the issue, in this case, issue means children, of such. This law is enacted for deterring such freeborn women from such shameful acts. Whatsoever freeborn woman shall marry a slave shall serve the master of such slave during the life of her husband, and that all the issue, meaning children, of such freeborn women so married shall be slaves as their fathers were. We see here the same intent to link ancestry, lineage, and enslaved status, but it follows the line of the father rather than the mother, as in Virginia. So what was different in the Maryland colony? We know that the first waves of English Virginia settlers took advantage of the head right system and became large plantation owners who formed the political and social elite of the colony. These men, the Virginia colony plantation owners, were not focused on family formation, and they did not adhere to moral codes that discouraged sex outside of marriage. Moreover, since they oversaw the enforcement of laws, they could make sure that they would not be sanctioned by any fornication laws. And again, fornication means sexual intercourse, any sexual intercourse outside of legal marriage. Virginia initially started to solidify racialized chattel slavery in an environment in which rich male English plantation owners focused on money and regarded sexual intercourse with any woman of lower social status as a prerogative. The 1662 law was constructed in a way that, in practice, allowed these men to father children and claim them as saleable property rather than as family. And most of them had no hesitation in doing just that. The photo is from much later, 1863, on the eve of the American Civil War. Both of these children were enslaved on the basis of African ancestry when the photo was taken. And I've repeated the 1662 Virginia partus sequitur vinculum law here and highlighted the fact that the issue was English men and enslaved women, and that the status of the child, bond, meaning enslaved or free, followed the condition of the mother. We see in the initial Maryland law establishing racialized chattel slavery is a response to something different than in Virginia, and the law makes it fairly clear what that something was. Female servants of English ancestry and enslaved men of African ancestry formed families, not just had sexual intercourse, but formed families. If the children of such families followed the condition of the mother, they would, quite inconveniently for creating a system of heritable racialized slavery, be both free and possessing African ancestry. Such families and children would make screamingly clear the lies needed to establish a reliably enslaved, self-reproducing labor force. So the Maryland law targeted first and foremost white women and Black men, who were likely to produce children they actually cared about rather than regarded as valuable property. Here on the slide, we can see the salient part of the 1664 Maryland Act, and that is that children are enslaved as their fathers were for the term of their lives, and the issue is English women who marry enslaved men with African ancestry. As with Virginia, it took Maryland legislators years of adjusting a series of laws before plantation owners and government figures got what they were looking for, an unconscious and immediate assumption in the minds of people of English ancestry that identifying people as Negro reflected inevitable nature rather than human construction. And moreover, that labeling someone as Negro meant that they could be assumed to be inferior, which in turn made their enslavement seem normal and unproblematic to those who were assured that they were in no danger themselves of becoming enslaved. For the last part of this lecture, I'm going to share an historical example, a microhistory, that shows not just how not natural these laws were and how they worked in practice over several generations. This will be the story of Irish Nell and Negro Charles, as they were each called at the time we're looking at. I told you earlier that Maryland was granted as a proprietary colony to a single individual rather than to a company. That individual was Cecilius or Cecil Calvert, second Lord Baltimore. You may also remember that the proprietor of Maryland was Catholic and had been granted the charter to the colony in 1632 by Charles I of Great Britain. Charles was beheaded by the parliamentarians, including the Puritan Cromwell in 1649, ushering in a very Catholic, unfriendly period in British history. Religious and political power struggles had been ongoing in England since the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century and Henry VIII's separation of the Anglican from the Catholic Church in 1534, and we will cover that more in the next lecture. The time period of greatest religious and political turmoil over these issues corresponded to the establishment and settlement of Britain's colonies on the east coast of North America. I'm going to add just a little bit here after reading your quiz answers, some of them. The people who settled in the Chesapeake colonies, Virginia, Maryland, that region, were not Puritans. The Puritans settled in New England. So the people coming to the Chesapeake colonies were not seeking religious freedom in the way you often hear the stories cast in popular American history. These people were either impoverished and Anglican, in which case it was no problem for them, or they were wealthy and Catholic, in which case they were most definitely not Puritan. They were, in fact, trying to seek safety away from the Puritan government of England. European religious disputes were not tangential, but intertwined in complicated ways into the lives of both ordinary and elite people in the colonies. The second Lord Baltimore had a son, Charles Calvert, who was raised in England with all the privileges of nobility, but also with an awareness that as a Catholic, his father's hold over the proprietorship of Maryland could be taken away at any time. In 1661, at the age of 24, Charles Calvert was sent to Maryland to become colonial governor, and to represent the family interests as his father was protecting them in England. On the left is the coat of arms of the Calvert family, and on the right is the current flag of Maryland. And you can see that the flag of Maryland comes directly from the Calvert family arms. And the Calverts were the Lords Baltimore. So if you know the city of Baltimore, Maryland, it was in fact named for the Lords Baltimore. In this image, the man is Charles Calvert's father and son. So this is Cecil and Charles Calvert's son. This was painted in 1669 to 1670. Cecil Calvert, second Lord Baltimore and proprietor of Maryland, is holding in his hand a map of Maryland, and the child on the other side of the map is his grandson, Charles Calvert's son. The meaning here is fairly clear. The family planned to hold on to the proprietorship of Maryland, handing it down through generations. This particular child in the image would not grow up to inherit Maryland, as he died in 1681. The child on the far left, the viewer's far left, was enslaved and had been brought to England from Maryland. His presence in the picture serves for the viewers at the time, for the white English viewers at the time, much the same purpose as the opulent fabrics and the map of Maryland, demonstrating the prestige of the Calvert family. If you have been linking dates in different parts of the story, and I don't blame you if you have not been, then you know that Charles Calvert held the governorship of Maryland in 1664, when the first of Maryland's acts intended to produce racialized chattel slavery was passed. Maryland had a partially elected government in addition to a governor appointed by the proprietor, but the governor made the rules over who could run for office. As Maryland's governor, Charles ruled that only men who owned 1,000 acres of land could be elected to the representative part of Maryland's government. This was part of an effort to protect the power of the Calvert family proprietorship of Maryland. Remember, the Calverts were Catholic, but white Protestant and Anglican indentured servants who survived their term and were male could own 50 acres of land, hence making the land requirement for voting higher than 50 acres, much higher. In 1675, on the death of his father, Charles Calvert became third Lord Baltimore and Lord Proprietor, in addition to still being governor of Maryland. This is Charles Calvert in the full regalia of his rank and offices. And you can see crown here, velvet fabric, ermine, and the wig, which was fashionable for upper-class men at the time, that type of wig. The third Lord Baltimore went to England at his father's death, upon which, as a first son, he received a substantial inheritance of lands, title, and power. Here is the same Charles Calvert, third Lord Baltimore, Lord Proprietor and Governor of Maryland. This was painted after his father's death, so fashions are closer to the 18th than to the 17th century. You might think Enlightenment and Isaac Newton, that sort of thing. We are getting into less upright, rigid fashions for men and more of this idea of the intellect. The ship seen through the window alludes to his power on both sides of the Atlantic. When he returned to Maryland in 1681, which he did, he didn't stay in England, he brought with him as part of his household a servant named Eleanor Butler, more commonly called Irish Nell. Lord Baltimore stayed at the plantation of a Major Boorman in Maryland. There, Nell washed, ironed, cooked, spun, labored in the fields, and provided services as a midwife. She also met an enslaved man held by Boorman and named Charles, commonly called Negro Charles. Irish Nell's work on the plantation was extensive, and Boorman purchased Nell's services or indenture from Baltimore. Also, in 1681, after Baltimore's return, Maryland updated the 1664 Act concerning Negroes and other slaves. And again, that's the name of the act. It turned out that there were several problems with the original act that hampered attempts to make the categories of Negro and slave synonymous. The first was in the title and text of the act, which distinguished the category Negro and the category slave by including the words and other between them, suggesting that not all slaves were Black. The second problem was the penalty placed on British servant women who married enslaved Black men. Those women became enslaved white women, meaning that white women, white people, could be enslaved, and undermining the justification for enslaving people categorized as Negro based on having African ancestry. There were attempts to justify the enslavement of these women by essentially saying they were just as bad as the men they married. But the fact remained that they linked the category white and the status enslaved in one and the same person. As it turned out, Maryland plantation owners were just as unscrupulous as Virginia ones. It took a different form given their immediate context and the wording of the law. Maryland plantation owners apparently encouraged relationships between white servant women and enslaved Black men. The plantation owner, after all, would now get a lifetime of work rather than just the term of indenture from the woman, and any children the couple had would legally be the property of the plantation owner. The 1681 law included the stipulation, so this is the updated law, that if a marriage between an enslaved man and a freeborn white woman who was a servant had been coerced or even permitted by the woman's master, then the woman would be released from servitude and any children would be born into freedom. The problem here was that those free children would link in themselves African ancestry and free, challenging the African ancestry equals enslaved and white equals free equations that the laws were intended to create. The intent of the 1681 law was to stop these marriages before any children could be born at all. Nell and Charles married in August of 1681 with the blessing and therefore the permission of the Bormans, who attended the wedding along with their white neighbors. The updated slave law took effect in September of 1681. They were married in August. The law didn't go into effect until September. Now, how do we know so much about this particular marriage, as well as similar marriages that took place around the same time? The answer is that in 1770, nearly 100 years after Nell and Charles's marriage, William Butler and Mary Butler, the enslaved grandchildren of Irish Nell, or Eleanor Butler, filed a petition for freedom on the grounds of their descent from a free white woman. The image on the slide is a cradle carved by an enslaved person in Maryland. You do not need to be able to see this image clearly, which is a good thing for you, right? It is a family tree like the lineage we looked at earlier for the royal family of England. Nell and Charles are on the left. Their children are in the second column, grandchildren in the third, great-grandchildren in the fourth, and so on. And I will remind you that the suit debated, meaning legal suit, not something you wear, the legal suit debated in 1770 was brought by two grandchildren of Charles and Nell. Nell and Charles had married a month before the 1681 law officially went into effect, but their children had been born after. So the question was, did Nell actually count as a free white woman? And were her children actually free? The court in 1770 called witnesses descended from the white people who attended the wedding of Charles and Nell. These witnesses all said that Nell had remained free after her marriage, although her children had been enslaved. The first court ruling favored the butlers, meaning the grandchildren who claimed that they should be free because Nell had been free. But the man who held the grandchildren, William and Mary, who was himself a grandson of the Boorman who held Nell and Charles, appealed this decision, and he won. William and Mary remained enslaved. A great-granddaughter of Nell and Charles brought a similar suit in 1787 and won unequivocally. In other words, she was granted her freedom with no objection. Why would one 1770 court agree that Nell had been a free white woman and then be overruled by another court? And why would a 1787 court rule without disagreement that Nell was a free white woman, thus freeing her great-granddaughter? The answer is that the series of laws linking whiteness with freedom and blackness with unfreedom had done their work. By 1779, the idea of an enslaved white woman was nonsensical, and the freedom of her great-granddaughter would be a formal exception to the idea that the categories black and enslaved naturally went together. Like Elizabeth I, Nell and Charles's great-granddaughter could exist as the exception that proves the rule, rather than providing a serious threat to entrenched patterns of power. The existence of this category, of this particular construction of race, and the divisions and hierarchy within it was information that had been relegated to the realm of apparently self-evident truths, in the words of anthropologist Mary Douglas. The work to naturalize the importance of one way of dividing human variability and assigning more value and privilege to one group had become a self-evident truth by 1787. We in the United States now are still living with the consequences. Key points for lecture 10. And remember, this is for both parts 1 in the last video and part 2 here. Early Virginia settlement in the Chesapeake region quickly came to rely on plantation agriculture for cash crops, initially tobacco. Early Virginia society formed an elite class of large plantation owners and a laboring class, both of these mostly men. The wealthy settlers valued money and aristocratic lifestyle. They did not care about stable families or providing education for the laboring class, and often for themselves, to be honest. English colonial leaders in the Americas deliberately wrote laws in order to create racialized, heritable slavery. The 1662 Partus Sequitur Ventrum law of the Virginia colony stipulated that the condition, free or enslaved, of the child followed that of the mother. The 1664 Maryland Act concerning Negroes and other slaves traced enslavement through the father's line. It took several decades to adjust and readjust the laws, but the idea was to make two seemingly natural racial divisions and to link one of them to unfreedom. The first was white equals free and black equals unfree. And black here meant having African ancestry. Did not mean that the person actually necessarily had particularly dark skin, especially if you think of generation after generation of Virginia planters fathering children. Maryland's original 1664 law had three limitations that interfered with the results the writers hoped for. Putting the words "and other" between Negro and slaves indicated that there could be some slaves who were not Black. The penalty to a white woman who married a Black man was that she, as well as her children, would become enslaved, showing that white slave was a category that could and did exist. Maryland plantation owners would encourage white female servants to marry Black enslaved men in order to have ownership over the couple's children, thus encouraging rather than discouraging the possibility that white could equal enslaved. In 1681, Maryland rewrote the law to discourage plantation owners from allowing white women and Black men to marry at all. The marriage of Nell Butler, known as Irish Nell, and Charles, known as Negro Charles, and the fate of their descendants show that although it took several generations, the Chesapeake slavery laws succeeded in naturalizing a particular construction of race that favored people of English ancestry. They being the laws, made that construction appear to be a self-evident truth that white people did not question. In 1770 and again in 1787, grandchildren and then a great-grandchild of Nell and Charles sued for their freedom on the basis of descent from a free white woman. The decision to grant freedom to the great-grandchild, but not the grandchildren a generation before, demonstrates how successful the slavery laws had been in the colonial Chesapeake. By the late 18th century, the idea of an enslaved white woman no longer seemed conceivable. White and Black categories, based on whether or not a person had African ancestry, had come to seem perfectly normal. They had become naturalized in American society, hegemonic American society, and just were not challenged anymore, barring by those people who were enslaved, of course. A relatively few free people with African ancestry were no longer a threat, as the racialized ordering of society in the Chesapeake had become a self-evident truth to those who were themselves not enslaved. I am signing off this lecture with bunnies because bunnies help me feel somewhat less despair about the world.